Good day. Today is Sunday, 9th February 2025, and I have to begin this program with a story almost completely ignored by most of the media, as far as I can see, in Britain and in the United States. I've been checking out the media outlets this morning: The Guardian, the Financial Times, the London Times, the BBC in Britain, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of those in the United States. Anyway, the news that, according to the New York Post, a New York newspaper, they were told by President Trump himself in a discussion which took place in the president's office on Air Force One, that the President Donald Trump, has spoken to Putin and that discussions are indeed underway to settle the conflict in Ukraine. And from the tone of the New York Post article, one gets the sense that the president was in a buoyant, exuberant mood. Now, the Russians have been completely blindsided by this. The Russian news agency, the official Russian news agency, TASS, has issued two reports about this conversation. The first one says Trump instructs his aide to organize meetings on Ukraine, and it reads as follows: President Donald Trump has once again stated that he has a specific plan to end the conflict in Ukraine and has called on his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, to organize meetings on this issue, the New York Post newspaper reported. I hope it's fast. Every day people are dying. The war is so bad in Ukraine. I want to end this damn thing, Trump said. The New York Post interviewed Trump on board Air Force One on Friday evening. At some point, Waltz joined him. Let's get these meetings going. They want to meet, Trump said, addressing Waltz. Notice that this report in TASS says absolutely nothing about a conversation between Putin and Trump, which is what the New York Post is reporting Trump as having himself confirmed. Then, shortly after, there was a further report from TASS, and this one does refer to Trump's comments about a telephone conversation with Putin, and it reads as follows: President Donald Trump has asserted that he had discussed the settling the Ukrainian conflict with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in a phone conversation. I'd better not say, he told the New York Post in an exclusive interview aboard Air Force One, replying to a question as to how many times the two leaders have spoken. That said, the US president did not specify when the two leaders interacted and whether this was before or after his inauguration. So this doesn't seem to be confirmation from TASS that there was a conversation, but they are here at least reporting that, according to the New York Post, Trump said that a conversation did actually take place. And then shortly after, we've had a comment also from TASS in which Peskov himself, Putin's spokesman, is asked about this conversation that the New York Post tells us Trump has confirmed, which supposedly took place between Putin and Trump. And this is how TASS is reporting this discussion. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said he could neither confirm nor deny publications about contacts between Russian leader Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump on Ukraine. Earlier, the New York Post wrote that Trump had reported discussing a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine with Putin by telephone, responding to a question from TASS whether Putin and Trump had a telephone conversation after the inauguration of the American leader, the Kremlin official replied, "What can be said about this news? As the administration in Washington unfolds its work, many different communications arise. These communications are conducted through different channels, and of course, amid the multiplicity of these communications, I personally may not know something, be unaware of something. Therefore, in this case, I can neither confirm nor deny it." Anyway, that appears to be saying, Peskov here appears to be saying that, well, if there was a telephone conversation between Putin and Trump, no one so far has told me. Of course, you must take this comment from Peskov with a shovelful of salt, which I do. I'm absolutely sure that if Trump and Putin have spoken, Peskov would not only know about it, but was probably present with Putin when Putin took the call. Just saying. Anyway, TASS then goes on to report that the head of the State Duma Committee on International Affairs, Leonid Slutsky, who is, by the way, also the head of Russia's liberal party, the LPDR, Liberal Democratic Party, the party that used to be led by Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Anyway, it reports Slutsky is saying that work on preparing contacts between Putin and Trump is at an advanced stage, which also seems to call into question whether there's, in fact, so far been an actual conversation between Trump and Putin. Well, at this point, I think it's worth going to what the New York Post itself is saying. And in fact, it's slightly vague, as we shall see. It says the following: Trump reveals, and it's by Miranda Devine, who is presumably the reporter who spoke with Trump. Trump reveals he's spoken with Putin by phone, says Russian president wants to see people stop dying in Ukraine war. President Trump has spoken to Russian leader Vladimir Putin on the phone to try to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine, he told the Post in an exclusive interview aboard Air Force One Friday. So this conversation took place 2 days ago. I mean, the conversation between presumably Miranda Devine and Donald Trump. "I'd better not say," said Trump when asked how many times the two leaders have spoken, but he believes Putin does care about the killing on the battlefield. "He wants to see people stop dying," said Trump. "All those dead people, young, beautiful people, they're like your kids, 2 million of them." That's a new figure. Presumably here, Trump is combining Ukrainian and Russian dead. I don't think anybody who's looked and followed the war closely thinks that the casualty rate really does amount to 2 million. But anyway, this is what Trump appears to have said. "They're like your kids, 2 million of them, and for no reason. The 3-year-old war never would have happened if he had been president in 2022, Trump asserted. "I always had a good relationship with Putin," he said, unlike his predecessor. "Biden was an embarrassment to our nation, a complete embarrassment." About that, by the way, Putin would probably agree with Trump. Trump said he had a concrete plan to end the war. "I hope it's fast. Every day people are dying. The war is so bad in Ukraine, I want to end this damn thing." Addressing National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who joined him in his study aboard Air Force One Friday night, the president said, "Let's get these meetings going. They want to meet. every day people are dying, young, handsome soldiers are being killed, young men like my sons, on both sides all over the battlefield. Then we further learn from this New York Post article that the United States is going to be represented at the Munich Security Conference, not by Donald Trump, but by the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and that Vance will probably meet and have a conversation with Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. Now, Vance has spoken and written very intelligently about the Ukraine war in the past, and he has been a consistent skeptic of it. So I suspect that would be an uncomfortable conversation between Vance and Zelensky. Vance impresses me as an extremely clever man, somebody who would see quite quickly through Zelensky's kaleidoscope of manipulations, just saying. And I don't think that Zelensky would particularly want to find himself in a conversation with Vance, just saying. But anyway, that discussion is apparently due to happen, and there doesn't seem to be any word here, at least in this New York Post article, about a meeting, a prospective meeting between Zelensky and Trump himself, though in another conversation a day or so ago, Trump did say that he was expecting Zelensky to come to Washington and that Trump might indeed meet him. Anyway, this report in the New York Post, at least the Ukrainian part of the report, then goes on to say that Trump said he wants to strike a $500 million deal with Zelensky to access rare earth minerals and gas in Ukraine in exchange for security guarantees in any potential peace settlement. So again, putting the whole business with Ukraine on a purely commercial, transactional basis. The Ukrainians are going to have to pay the United States for their security guarantees. This, according to Trump, with rare earths and minerals, which for the moment they don't control. Now, reading this article in the New York Post, I am going to say that it doesn't seem to me to quote, well, it doesn't quote that part of Trump's conversation in which he appears to confirm that there has indeed been a telephone conversation between Putin and himself. We are told right at the beginning that President Trump has spoken to Russian leader Vladimir Putin on the phone to try to negotiate an end to the Ukraine war. He told the Post in an exclusive interview aboard Air Force One Friday. But his exact words confirming this are not quoted. And that, it does seem to me, leaves at least open the possibility that the journalists from the New York Post misheard what Trump said and perhaps misunderstood Trump's confirmation that contacts with the Russians are ongoing to mean that Trump confirmed that he has been in direct conversation with Putin himself. I have to open up this possibility because, as we've just seen, the reports from the Russian news agency TASS and from Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov strongly suggest, or at least appear to suggest, that the Russians know nothing about a call between Putin and Trump. And the Russian reports, without exactly denying that the conversation has took place, seem intended to cast doubt on the fact of that conversation. The Russians, by the way, if Trump had appeared to say that there was a conversation, reading a report from the New York Post, which appears to say that Trump has confirmed that there was a conversation, the Russians might not be willing to deny the fact of the conversation outright, even if it in fact has not taken place, because that would come dangerously close to calling Trump a liar, which is not something I think at this stage that the Russians would want to do. Anyway, I think despite these uncertainties and ambiguities, that some kind of telephone call, some kind of telephone conversation between Putin and Trump has actually taken place. I think that the Russians probably insisted that the conversation should remain confidential. They didn't want the fact that the conversation took place to be publicized, at least not at this time. Or perhaps it was the Americans who asked that it be kept confidential. One doesn't know. But the Russians have been blindsided and taken aback by the fact that this private conversation, something, by the way, which is not unusual between world leaders, the Russians have been blindsided by the fact that Trump then went ahead and spoke to the New York Post and disclosed the fact that he's been talking to Putin when it had been previously agreed between the Americans and the Russians that the fact that such conversations were taking place would not be disclosed. So this is how I read all of this. And the fact that these conversations are probably taking place and are probably taking place behind locked doors in secret does suggest that there is now finally, perhaps over the last few days, genuine contact now starting to develop between the Russians and the Americans as to how to find a way out of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, a short while ago, I received an email from a source who is very well informed about the situation on the ground in Moscow and who I've cited before, and who obtains information from a semi-public place, which is the Russian Parliament, the State Duma. Now, the Duma is regularly kept informed by the Kremlin about what is going on. The Russian President Putin and his officials have a general obligation to keep the Russian Parliament informed. And it looks as if they have been briefing members of the Duma over the last couple of days about contacts between Russia and the United States. And some of this information has apparently been circulated within the Duma's own information channels, the ones that are accessible to members of the Duma and their staffers. So, as I said, this is not classified information that I'm conveying. It is semi-public information, though not information which I myself have direct access to. Anyway, the report that I've received says this, that the Americans have indeed reached out to the Russians over the course of the last couple of days, that the discussions are at a very early stage and have been conducted at a very, very preliminary level, that the Americans have told the Russians that the United States does want to see the fighting in Ukraine end, and that it is broaching to the Russians a larger deal to end the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm using the word deal advisedly because this is what it looks like. Now, the deal comes both with a carrot and a stick. The carrot is the complete lifting, so far as I can judge, of practically all the sanctions. Russia would be reconnected to SWIFT. The Russian assets in the that have been frozen in the West would be unfrozen and returned to the Russians. Remarkably, the Russians would be able to resume export of oil and gas to Europe. They'd be able to reopen all the pipelines, including the pipelines across Ukraine. They would be able to start repairing the Nord Stream pipelines, and gas would be able to flow across the pipelines once the Nord Stream pipelines had been repaired, which is, if true, a startling concession. And by the way, it casts in a new light the decision made about a week ago by the Danish authorities to allow Gazprom for the first time access to the pipelines in Danish territorial waters, allow Gazprom to take steps to keep those parts of the Nord Stream pipelines that are still undamaged in a state of repair. And, well, this source is telling me that the Russians, in time, might, if there is an agreement, be able to repair the pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines, in their entirety. That's what the source is telling me. I'd previously speculated that the reason the Danes had agreed to this was because of suggestions from Germany. And I mentioned that there'd recently been an article in the Financial Times which has floated the possibility, apparently raised by officials from Germany, that after the conflict in Ukraine has ended, Europe should once again return to importing pipeline gas from Russia. So all of this starts to hang together, and it suggests that there's been some sort of quiet level discussions between the Americans and maybe the Germans, and that the Americans have floated with the Germans the possibility of Germany once again importing gas from Russia via the pipelines, and that the Germans have raised that possibility with the European Union, and that this is part of some wider discussions that the Americans are also conducting with the Russians. Anyway, that, if you like, is the offer, or if you prefer, the bribe. But the threat, or the stick waved in parallel with the carrot, is that if the Russians don't agree to freeze the war, basically along the current front lines, if the Russians don't agree to that, then the United States will declare an all-out economic war on Russia. They will start sanctioning every single company and business around the world that trades with Russia in any form. They will start sanctioning every single ship that carries Russian oil and gas. They will start sanctioning every single country that imports oil and gas from Russia and which continues to trade with it in any form. So that is the stick, that is the threat. So the Russians, supposedly, over the last couple of days, have been presented with this carrot and stick, this bribe and this threat. And the source told me that there has been some discussion about all of this in the Duma. Some have suggested that this be rejected by Russia outright. Others are saying that China and India need to be consulted first, but that there is a general consensus in Moscow that both the carrot and the stick should be rejected, that Russia should refuse the freeze, that a freeze does not work in Russia's interests and does not address the underlying issues in Ukraine, and that what the Russians need is to press forward. And if the Americans do declare their all-out economic war on Russia, Russia should meet it head on, that they can absorb the blow. And besides, I suspect, in fact I'm absolutely sure, that deep down the Russians don't believe in this threat. They probably calculate, in fact they almost certainly do calculate, that it is a bluff. And perhaps here it's worth explaining why the Russians would think it is a bluff. Because, of course, if the United States were ever to act on these sort of threats, two things would happen. Firstly, big countries like China and India and others, the other members of the BRICS states, would be put in a position where they would have to choose, do they abide by these sanctions or not? If they abide by these sanctions, they surrender part of their economic sovereignty to the United States. Given that Russia is a vital trade partner, both of China and India, it is most unlikely that the governments of those countries would be prepared to agree to that. There would be massive amount of diplomatic pushback, and quite plausibly this would severely damage, severely impact the relations of the United States with these powerful countries. And by the way, that would include Saudi Arabia as well as others. But the second point is that if the United States were to declare all-out economic war on Russia in the way that apparently it is now threatening to do, or has been threatening to do, that would in effect take Russian energy off the market, if it ever were to happen like that. And given how important Russia is as a player in global markets, in markets for energy, markets for food, markets for fertilizer, for uranium, for diamonds, in every conceivable type of product that you can think of in the commodity sphere, the importance that Russia is as a market itself for exporters from many different countries. If something like that were to happen, it is impossible to see that this would not have a major impact on global prices, prices for energy, prices for food, prices for every conceivable kind of product, and we would see a surge in inflation, which would eventually reach the United States as well. And here I think a further point would be made, which is that, of course, if the United States were to declare an outright economic war against Russia of the kind that is being suggested, the Russians would respond, and they would respond by doing that very thing that they're being repeatedly accused of doing, but which up to this time they have not done, which is that they would respond as a country in a state of economic war would, by putting its entire economy on a mobilization basis. Now, it is widely overlooked and forgotten that countries have gone to war and have had to impose the kind of economic controls that happen when they are at war, All of the belligerents in World War II, for example, did it. They established price controls, they established rationing systems, they did all of those things that they would have to do in the kind of conditions where they found themselves at war. And it is difficult to imagine any country in the world actually in a better position to do that than Russia is in today. I say that because Russia is a continental economy. It has access to all the food and raw materials that it needs in order to keep its economy going. It has, as we have seen, a significant industrial base. It could start restricting the sale of certain types of consumer goods to consumers. It might impose price controls. It could impose rationing and planning systems. It could divert resources to the military industrial base. It could start mobilizing and imposing controls on population. And it could do all of these things because it has the means and it has the resources to pull it off. Just as the United States did when, of course, it too found itself in a war-type situation during the Second World War. Just saying. And apparently the Russians are busy telling each other in response to these threats from the administration that these are basically a bluff that Russia should be prepared to call because of the massive consequences on the US's own economy if it were to actually start to do these things. But if the US is misguided enough and reckless enough and foolish enough to go down this approach, well, in that case, the Russians can withstand this. They can withstand the blow. They can move back towards a controlled, planned mobilization economy. Probably they would only need to do it for a limited period. And they would apparently, in that case, change the status of the special military operation. It could be upgraded into an actual war. After all, the country would not just be looking at sanctions, but at an economic war. And at that point in Ukraine, the gloves would indeed be pulled off, and that the Russians would start behaving much more aggressively, as they could do, than they have been doing up to now. And of course, the Russians do have escalation options in Ukraine. They have not, for example, so far launched strikes on nuclear power stations. They have not attacked the Dnieper bridges. They've not made serious efforts to target Zelensky and his government. They could demand, for example, that Western governments remove their personnel from Ukraine, including their civilian personnel from Kiev. They can do all kinds of things if, of course, the whole situation escalates to a point where the Russians consider themselves to be in a state of outright war. So I gather that this has all been communicated back to the Americans, and the Russians in the totality are saying that they're not prepared to accept the bribes, and they're not prepared to accept the threats either. In the case of the bribes, I suspect that one reason anyway why the Russians would not be minded to accept them is that they don't believe that the United States would follow through. They don't believe that the United States, they probably don't believe that the United States is really serious about allowing pipeline gas to return to Europe, for example. The United States spent decades campaigning against pipeline gas from Russia reaching Europe. Donald Trump himself imposed sanctions on Nord Stream when he was previously president. I think the Russians believe that if they made concessions, the Americans would simply pocket the concessions and find reasons or excuses not to follow through with their promises. Maybe that is not what the Americans themselves are thinking of doing, but the Russians can only judge American actions from their own experience, and their experience would tell them to be very careful before accepting promises from the United States. And the fundamental reason why the Russians are going to reject these messages, are going to push back on them, is that the proposal, which appears to be some kind of proposal for a freeze, even if it comes with a firm promise from the United States that Ukraine will not be admitted into NATO, does not address the major security issues that the Russians have about Ukraine, and which they have brought up now in discussion after discussion, in statement after statement. They will not accept a mere promise from the United States not to seek NATO membership from Ukraine. After all, the United States has made identical promises in the past, which it has not honoured, and the Russians probably will conclude that even a promise like that, if it's only backed by a freeze, is insufficient. A proper, full discussion ending in a full settlement of the conflict, one that the Russians have already outlined in Putin's June 2024 proposals. Only that, from the point of view of the Russians, will do. Now, I'm going to make a number of points here. I suspect that, as I said, Trump and Putin have had a conversation. I suspect that Trump, primarily in that conversation, was looking to see whether Putin is up for discussion. And the fact that Trump was in an exuberant and buoyant mood when he spoke to the New York Post probably means that the discussion happened fairly recently, that he was pleased by the fact that Putin confirmed to him that he is indeed willing to sit down and have discussions. And we see that Trump put on a show in front of the New York Post and said to Mike Waltz, who was apparently, brought in at one point, go ahead, the Russians want to talk. We can't waste any more time. All of these people are dying. You must intensify the contacts and presumably move towards a formal meeting between Putin and Trump himself. So I think that all of that is going on, and I think the Russians are probably also saying to Trump, look, we are prepared to talk. We're prepared to talk, and we're prepared to come to an understanding with you. Apparently, according to the same source who contacted me, the Americans, for example, raised the topic of Iran. And Trump, in his discussion with the New York Post, said that he wants to do some kind of deal with Iran, and that the deal basically is about Iran not pressing forward to acquire nuclear weapons. And I'm going to suggest that the Russians probably have said to Trump, look, we don't want the Iranians to have nuclear weapons either, and we are actually prepared to facilitate this deal between the Iranians and yourself. We do indeed have influence over Iran, and we can help you to achieve that. Now, I say all of this because there's been some very interesting comments made by the supreme leader of Iran over the last couple of days. Firstly, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has again reiterated his well-known position that Iran should not move forward to develop nuclear weapons. Doing so is haram, it is prohibited under his understanding of Iranian law, Islamic law, sorry, I should say Islamic law, not Iranian law. And for the moment at least, Iran, according to Khamenei, is not going to move forward with a nuclear weapons program. This is despite reports that appeared a couple of days ago saying that Iranian scientists are now looking for ways to accelerate development of nuclear weapons. They're looking for shortcuts. I said that I thought that was most unlikely to be true. I don't believe that there are any shortcuts in nuclear weapons technology. I felt previously that this discussion, this article which appeared in the New York Times, I believe, saying that Iranian scientists were looking for shortcuts in the quest to acquire a nuclear bomb, that almost certainly originated from Israeli sources and was probably published in conjunction with Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington, and that Netanyahu probably was hoping, when he came to Washington, to persuade Trump again to move forward with an attack on Iran, an Israeli and American attack on Iran. But it was actually clear over the course of the discussions between Trump and Netanyahu, and in Trump's public comments, that Trump is not actually seeking an attack on Iran. For the moment, he's only talking about economic pressure on Iran, the return to maximum sanctions, maximum pressure, and all of that. So, the Iranians, according to Khamenei, are not, in fact, proceeding with nuclear weapons developments. And this is despite this New York Times article, which tells us otherwise. And that might suggest that the Iranians are, in fact, prepared to come to some kind of understanding with the United States, because Trump appears to be setting the demand that Iran forswear acquisition of nuclear weapons. But here we have Khamenei saying that actually Iran has no intention to acquire them because it is contrary to Islamic law. So that's one thing. But Khamenei has also been saying some other things. He has made a public statement in which he says that Iran must not negotiate with the United States. I'm taking this now from Iran's Tasnim news agency, and I read out what he says. A leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, considered that negotiations with the United States would not be a wise and honorable move, saying that won't help settle Iran's problems considering the past experiences. On the anniversary of the historic pledging allegiance of Air Force commanders with Ayatollah Khamenei, that's the original leader of the Iranian Revolution, known as the Khomafaran Allegiance, on February 8th, 1979, a large number of the commanders and staff of the Army Air Force and Air Defense Force met with Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran on Friday. In remarks at the meeting, Ayatollah Khamenei referred to discussions and debates about negotiations in newspapers and on the internet, as well as the remarks of certain individuals in this regard. The focus of these discussions is negotiations with the United States, and they speak of negotiations as a good thing, as though anyone who is opposed to negotiation itself misunderstands that it is good, the leader said. He highlighted the Foreign Ministry's extensive diplomatic efforts in negotiating and signing agreement with all countries worldwide, stating the only exception in this regard is the United States. Of course, we do not count Israel as an exception because this regime is basically not a government at all, but rather a land-usurping gang. Explaining why the United States is an exception in negotiations, Ayatollah Khamenei said, "Some pretend that if we sit at the negotiating table it would solve certain problems, but the reality that we must correctly understand is that negotiations with the United States have no effect on solving the country's problems." Ayatollah Khamenei cited the negative experience of the 2010s, about 2 years of negotiations with the United States and several other countries, which led to the JCPOA as proof of the futility of negotiating with the US. Our government at the time sat with them, went back and forth and engaged in negotiations, laughed, shook hands, acted friendly towards them, and did everything, and an agreement was formed in which the Iranian side, with great generosity, granted many concessions to the other side. However, the Americans did not honor that agreement. And of course, he went on and said many other things about the United States, its aggressive global policies, and all of those kind of things. Now, on the one hand, we have Khamenei saying Iran is not going to pursue nuclear weapons, and on the other, he's saying that Iran is not going to negotiate with the United States, despite maximum pressure, despite Trump saying he wants a deal with Iran. I think that what this means, what Khamenei's comments mean, is that the Iranians, who have made recently treaty commitments to the Russians in the partnership agreement that they signed with the Russians in Moscow on 17th January, they've made treaty commitments that they will not seek the acquisition of nuclear weapons, are in fact preparing for some kind of general understanding which will involve the United States. What they're not prepared to do, what Khamenei is signaling, is that they're not prepared to enter into direct negotiations with the United States by themselves. They want those negotiations to be conducted involving third countries, first and foremost the Russians. Probably the Chinese and the Indians will in time be involved as well. And they want a kind of global settlement involving the United States, but also involving these other countries also. And that all strongly suggests to me that the Russians, who have, in fact, as I said, been receiving, as part of all the other package of things about Ukraine, the threats, the bribes, and all of that, according to this source, the Americans have been asking the Russians, can you slow down your connections with the Americans or with the Iranians? Can you stop moving forward with payment systems and all of those things? I suspect that the Russians have been informing the Iranians about all of this. And the Iranians have come out and said, no, we are not going to press forward with nuclear weapons development, which is, of course, what they agreed last month in a formal treaty, a treaty which the Russian parliament, I understand, has ratified, and which the Iranian parliament is due to ratify next month. They've already agreed to that with the Russians. So, the scene is being set for some kind of long-term deal involving not just Russia and Ukraine, but perhaps Iran and the Middle East also to be done. This is what it looks like to me. Just saying. Now, I say that, I ought to say that there's been another article in the Daily Telegraph today, which says that Iranian military officials have been pressing Khamenei to authorize them to move forward with nuclear weapons development in Iran, and that they're very exasperated by Khamenei's refusal to agree to this, and they do not understand this strategy of simultaneously ruling out negotiations with the Americans and ruling out the acquisition of nuclear weapons. I have said in the past that the one newspaper in Britain which I cannot imagine the Iranians communicating this type of information to is the Daily Telegraph, which is exceptionally hostile and antagonistic to Iran, and which actively advocates for regime change in Iran. And the appearance of this article in the Daily Telegraph now inclines me even further to think that these articles about supposed internal Iranian discussions are being planted and publicized in the Daily Telegraph by various Western intelligence agencies, perhaps the British, but ultimately probably by Israel's also. The Israelis still want a conflict with Iran. That remains very much Prime Minister Netanyahu's own objective. He is continuing to promote the story, which he's been plugging for the last 20 plus years, that the Iranians are moving ahead with development of nuclear weapons. We had the article to that effect in the New York Times. We've had this latest article in the Daily Telegraph, which says that Iranian military officials want to move forward against the authority, the decision of Ayatollah Khamenei. They want to move forward with nuclear weapons development. And I think that this is all, as I said, part of a game of trying to pressure Trump into ultimately breaking off all discussions with Iran and moving forward with a plan to strike at Iran. So I think the discussions are underway. I think that they're underway at the moment between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians are keeping the Iranians informed that this is what explains Khamenei's latest statements. I think that the Iranians have confirmed to the Russians that which they previously agreed to just a month ago, that they're not actually going to move forward with nuclear weapons, that is not their intention, that they still expect, however, to receive weapons from the Russians, that the Russians will continue to arm Iran. There were further reports that Sukhoi 35 fighter jets from Russia have now arrived in Iran. I think that what the Russians are holding out is some kind of guarantee between themselves and the Americans that they will ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons, that they will give the Americans that guarantee in return for the guarantee to protect Iranian security that they have already given to the Iranians as part of this partnership treaty that they signed with the Iranians just last month. So I think this is where all of this is going. So discussions about Ukraine also, obviously, this is the center, and the Russians are probably telling the Americans, look, we hear what you say. We're not going to be intimidated by your threats. We don't believe your threats. But if you really want to go there, we will take it head on. We have the means. We have the resources. Nobody wins against us in economic wars or wars of attrition of any kind. We are prepared for them. We have withstood them in the past. We can withstand them again. And the disruption you will cause to your own economy will be enormous. That's one thing. We are not prepared to take your bribes either. We don't really believe in them. We do, however, want a general settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, but the basis has to be the proposals we outlined in June last year, Istanbul Plus, in other words, and ultimately, these do not touch on the core interests of the United States. And it could be, but packaging these two issues together, Ukraine and Iran, bringing these two topics together in a single package, obviously there will be different agreements, will make it easier for Trump to sell whatever he agrees with the Russians about Ukraine in the United States, because it will cover Iran too, and as he will be able to argue, it will secure the future security of Israel. So I could see how this thing might be played. I want to stress that this is not just speculation. As I said, I've obtained all of this information from what I consider to be a very, very reliable source. And it is consistent with all the signals and signs, the public signs that we are hearing, that a discussion is indeed now underway about moving forward with Russia and with Iran. And there will be a negotiation. And that this is going to be a negotiation not just about Ukraine, but, as the Russians doubtless want, about the general situation in Western Eurasia, which of course includes Iran too. So anyway, that is what the Russians are holding out for. Now, of course, it could all go wrong. It could be that Kellogg and Waltz will come back to Trump. They will say that the Russians are sticking to Istanbul Plus, that this isn't really acceptable for the United States, that a declaration of economic war is therefore the only way forward, in which case we will land in a much, much bigger crisis than we are in today. I don't think Trump himself wants to go there, and for that reason, I don't think we will get there. The important thing is that finally, after a lot of maneuvering and uncertainty, the Americans, Trump himself, are moving forward. And perhaps from Trump's point of view, the fact that Iran is apparently under discussion, that is perhaps one of the things that has, as I said, given him that extra bounce, which he showed in that article in the New York Post. By the way, just to return to that article, notice that directly after the discussion about Ukraine, the article in the New York Post does switch to a discussion of the situation with Iran. I'll just read the words. On Iran, Trump told the Post, "I would like a deal done with Iran on non-nuclear. I would prefer that to bombing the hell out of it. They don't want to die. Nobody wants to die. If we make the deal, Israel wouldn't bomb them." He would not reveal details of any potential negotiations with Iran. In a way, I don't like telling you what I'm going to tell them. You know, it's not nice. I could tell what I have to tell them, and I hope they decide that they're not going to do what they're currently thinking of doing. What they've said they're not going to do, by the way, but never mind. And I think they'll really be happy. I don't think it's coincidence that in a discussion about Ukraine, Donald Trump then goes off and talks about not just a deal over Ukraine, but a deal with Iran. To repeat again, that is exactly what my source is telling me. The Americans are coming to the Russians. They're talking about having a deal on Ukraine. They're making wild promises and wilder threats, which the Russians are ignoring. And they're also talking about their desire also to do some kind of deal on Iran. Anyway, there we are. Let's move on. Let's now consider where all this, of course, leaves us. The first thing to say is that if all of these discussions are taking place, then we are in a position where there are indeed discussions going on between the Americans and the Russians, and both the Europeans and the Ukrainians are not participating. Precisely the thing that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are most unhappy about. In my opinion, that is the only way that this conflict can in fact be resolved. So I am not surprised by that, and I would consider that to be a good thing. Probably Zelensky has been told at some level about these discussions between the Americans and the Russians, and these extraordinary baroque statements that Zelensky has been making, statements which combine warnings about how dangerous it would be for the Americans to talk to the Russians without involving the Ukrainians, but also demands for nuclear weapons, long-range missiles, the presence of Western troops on Ukrainian territory, the bitter comments about the way in which Ukraine has been betrayed over NATO. All of these things are signs of how rattled Zelensky is by all that has been taking place, and by the fact that apparently, for the moment at least, the Americans don't want to involve him in the discussions. He has already also undoubtedly been rattled by all the American talk about elections in Ukraine, which he will interpret correctly as indications, clear indications, that the Americans are looking to get rid of him, that they realize that he will stand in the way of any kind of agreement made between the Americans and the Russians on Ukraine. So we can understand why the Ukrainians are unhappy. But what about the Europeans? Well, the Germans and the French are in a deeply chaotic situation. We have an election in Germany, which is still some weeks away. At the moment, the situation there looks very complex and chaotic. We won't have a clear idea of what's happening until the election actually happens. In France, situation is little better. About a week ago, the French Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou, decided to ram through his budget, which is essentially identical to Michel Barnier's budget, the budget of the previous Prime Minister, to ram it through by decree, ignoring a vote in the French Parliament. The radical left party, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, immediately went forward and proposed a vote of no confidence in Bayrou. The socialists at that point split, and after internal discussions, they decided that they would not support the vote of no confidence against Bayrou because they undoubtedly fear that if such a thing were to happen, France would move towards elections in which the socialists would be toast. Just saying. So they voted against the vote of no confidence. By the way, Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National also, though for entirely different reasons, also decided to vote, or rather not to support the vote of no confidence. They did so because had they supported the vote of no confidence, that would have enabled the socialists to pose as the party that was combining with Macron's centre to protect the Republic from the radical extremists on the left and the right by abstaining, apparently, on the vote. The socialists were left, the Rassemblement calculated that the socialists were left basically hanging out to dry. Mélenchon is now saying that the united left bloc in the parliament has collapsed and that the coalition between the socialists and his France Unbowed faction is now ended. On the Duran and on these programs, I've been predicting for some time that that would happen. Now, that might all seem good news for President Macron, but it looks as if there's going to be yet another vote of no confidence in the government, perhaps as soon as next week. This one will be proposed by Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National. There have been various comments that the government has made on immigration policy, which the socialists are embarrassed about, and apparently they're now again asking themselves whether they can support this government in the vote of no confidence or whether they might have to vote against it. The point is that the situation in France remains completely chaotic. So in light of all of this, France and Germany are out of the picture at the moment. The fact that discussions are taking place between the Americans and the Russians on Ukraine and potentially over Iran as well is something that the French and the Germans aren't in any kind of position to object to. Then we have the British. And there's going to be apparently a Ramstein meeting. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, has declined to chair it. Strongest sign that the Americans are indeed now looking to extricate themselves from the Ukraine disaster. So who comes along and agrees to chair it in their place? Mr. Healy, the British Defence Secretary. As I've said in the past, you can always tell a clown. They come towards you, all bells and whistles, full of themselves, rattling away, putting on a show which everybody can see from a distance is completely absurd, but which they themselves don't seem to understand quite how absurd it is. The mighty United States, the global superpower, the hyperpower of yesterday, is pulling out, and Britain is apparently coming forward to take its place. Well, there is the expression useful idiot. It's been used in all kinds of unkind ways in the past. It looks to me as if the Starmer government is eager to fulfill that role. Since I've talked about the Starmer government, very briefly, I should say that there is a brilliant article about Starmer and the Starmer government in Naked Capitalism by Eve Smith, I was surprised at how insightful and understanding of the situation in Britain Eve Smith was, even though she's not British, and I believe she's not even based in this country. So there we are. Anyway, so the Europeans are out of the picture, the Ukrainians are out of the picture, the Russians and the Americans are talking with each other. At the moment, these are discussions, these are talking points that they're exchanging with each other. Apparently both Kellogg and Waltz have been in on the course, though it's likely, as I said, that Putin and Trump have indeed spoken, though we can't be 100% certain of this. And for the moment, at least, as I said, the discussions are at a very, very basic level. But as I've said many times, when people do start talking with each other, more often than not, over time, something does come out. Some kind of positive agreement or consensus does begin to emerge. Whether that will end the conflict in Ukraine is a completely different matter. It could be that the fighting in Ukraine will continue because the Ukrainians will reject whatever it is that the Americans and the Russians agree to with each other. But at that point, Donald Trump will have the leeway, the freedom, finally, to walk away. Now, before finishing, I think, again, it's worth saying a little bit about the military situation. Group of Forces North has provided more updates about the fighting in Kursk. It's clear to me that the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk miscarried disastrously, and that the Russians are indeed not only have successfully repelled the offensive in Kursk, but that they are pressing harder in Sverdlikovo. The Group of Forces North spoke about how Syrskyi and Zelensky have basically ordered the Ukrainian forces in Sverdlikovo to stand firm, and Group of Forces North has saying that has in effect doomed them to a situation where their only option, if they want to remain alive, is to surrender to the Russians. Group of Forces North, by the way, has been predicting for some time that Zelensky and Syrskyi are planning one last big throw offensive in Kharkiv region to drive the Russians out of Volchansk. Group of Forces North are saying that they're ready, that when the offensive comes, they will repel it. And then, interestingly, Group of Forces North say that once this offensive is repelled, that will put the Russians in a position where they can complete the liberation of all the territory in Kharkiv region that Russia previously controlled and which the Ukrainians took from them. So that suggests that the Russians do have plans for further expansion of the territory they control in Kharkiv as well. Just saying. And, well, elsewhere, the war continues in much the same way as it has. Now, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, as I said, it's a very nationalist, pro-war newspaper, but with a very strong team of military reporters. They provided a very interesting rundown of the military situation on the west bank of the Oskol River and also in Kursk region. And it is clear that the expansion of the Russian bridgeheads in west of the Oskol River are now being seen by the Russians as a major event and one which will open the way for further big advances by the Russians in the Kharkiv area and in the area north of Slavyansk. Just saying. Everywhere else, the fighting continues, pretty much as I've said. Torets has now been cleared. Chasov Yar, perhaps a month away from being cleared also. The Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that the village of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, just directly east of Kramatorsk, village that the Wagner organization reached the outskirts of in the spring of 2023 during the Bakhmut battles, that this village has now fallen completely under Russian control. The point is that the Russians continue their advances right across the contact line. And the Russians have now had some further interesting news about their position in a completely different part of the world. The new self-appointed president of Syria, Al-Jalani, of course he now calls himself President Shara. Shara apparently was his original given name, just saying. Anyway, he, or rather his officials, have now made it fairly clear that they do indeed want the Russian bases to stay in Syria. They said that the attitude of the Russians to the Syrian authorities has completely changed, that the Russians and the Syrians therefore can be friends again. In light of this, there's no reason why the Russians should give up their bases in Syria. A deal can be done, no doubt it will be done. And, well, the two big bases, Khmeimim and Tartus, likely to remain in Syria. An outcome which, prior to the fall of Bashar al-Assad, no one would have predicted would happen in the event of Assad's fall. So it looks as if, probably not for a very high price, the Russians are going to keep their bases in Syria after all. Now, I should say that now there have been more reports about the situation in Syria, the actual situation in Syria. After the euphoric reporting of the last few weeks, I noticed that there's now gradual admissions that far from getting better, the situation in Syria has been deteriorating. There's been an article in The Guardian by my old friend, Simon Tisdall, just saying. He speaks about the fact that Al-Jalani's network, HTS, doesn't control physically most of Syria. I've been saying this for weeks. He talks about how the economic situation in Syria is deteriorating, how the security situation is very poor, and how Syria has become a chessboard in which major regional powers, Israel, Turkey, to some extent Iran, and of course, as we now see, Russia, continue to move their pieces around. The United States, for its part, is pulling out. Turkey has reached an agreement. In other words, it has told President Shara to agree to the establishment of Turkish bases, permanent military bases in Syria. I've been hearing from all sorts of sources that in Ankara now they have buyer's remorse about the fall of Assad, that this was not what they really wanted, and that they now realize that having broken Syria, the Turks now own Syria and that this comes with a whole set of other problems. Just saying. But the point is that far from being the losers in the conflict in Syria, as of this moment in time, it seems to me that the Russians are coming out in a kind of a way the winners, because they have none of the responsibilities towards the new Syria that the Israelis, the Turks, the Americans and all of those other people have. They have none of the responsibilities towards Syria that they had in Bashar al-Assad's time. No doubt they will pay the Syrians a certain amount of money. The point is that they can keep their bases in the meantime. They won't have to worry any longer about brokering deals on behalf of Assad, who they appear to have found a difficult person at times to work with. They can just hang on to their bases, pay the Syrians a certain amount of money, build up their bases to whatever extent they want to. We'll see how extensive that is. And all they have to do is sit tight, even as Syria plays out and all of the various other parties fight it out there between them. So, looking at things today from Putin's desk, if you put yourself in his desk in the Kremlin, well, I doubt that he's opening any champagne bottles. I don't think he drinks very much, by the way. I don't know whether he even drinks champagne. But I doubt that he's falling into any degree of euphoria. But he probably feels that things overall are starting to move increasingly in Russia's direction. The Russians held on to their bases in Syria. Their economy is performing very strongly, as I've discussed in recent programs. The military situation in Ukraine is improving from Russia's point of view every single day. And the Russians and the Americans are coming to talk. They want Russia's help with Iran, which gives the Russians more leverage. And the Americans want out of Ukraine, which of course suits the Russians perfectly. And they're making threats, which Putin probably isn't taking seriously, because they would be so counterproductive for the Americans. But they're also making offers which Putin is probably skeptical about, but some of which he might be able to cash in. Repayment of frozen assets to Russia, reconnection to SWIFT, pipeline deliveries to Europe, all of those things. As I said, Putin is a very, very careful, methodical, risk-averse man. That's what he has consistently been. He doesn't take risks. He doesn't gamble. He has his objectives, which he set out clearly, and he's always impressed me as someone who moves methodically and purposefully towards achieving those objectives. But I doubt that he has felt more confident about the situation at any point over the last 3 years than he feels today. Just saying. Meanwhile, the telephone call between Trump and Xi, which is supposed to take place on Tuesday, apparently has been postponed. It looks like a trade war between China and the United States is approaching on the horizon. And again, from Putin's point of view, not that he welcomes that, he certainly doesn't. Publicly, he wouldn't say that. But from Putin's point of view, if the Americans and the Chinese are at odds with each other, well, let's say that is not a bad thing for Russia. So, as I said, this morning, as he turns up for work, at his desk, he probably feels quietly confident about the overall situation and will continue to do so right up to the point when perhaps next month he will finally meet with Donald Trump. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, links also under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.